The first speaker for today is Debjyoti Bardhan. He is going to talk about theoretical high energy physics. Theoretical high energy, oops, it's too much. Let's ask Debjyoti itself what it is, and he is also going to talk about how to test a theory.
Oh, this is the mandatory audio test. People are there back in here, right? Okay. So Shubha already introduced me. I'm Debjyoti. I work on theoretical physics, and much of my work, since it's on theoretical sciences, much of my work involves testing out a theory. So we have to differentiate between which theories are acceptable and which are not. Okay, and we do it in various ways, and I'm going to tell you how we do it. How many in the audience like stories? Because I'm going to go in story mode. Okay, fine. So lots of people like stories. Now I'm going to need your help for the first story. Okay, you have to identify what the first story is going to be about. What do you think the first story is going to be about? Newton and gravitation. Awesome. So it's a force that you're all very familiar with. You must have studied it in school. Your teachers have told you. You have had exams and might not have been able to do all the problems, but that's okay. Now, so gravitation basically tells you that if there is an object with mass, it pulls every other object, okay, which has mass by a force of gravitation. So the earth and the sun, they pull each other, the moon and the earth, they pull each other. Even I'm standing here and all of you sitting there, we are pulling each other with the force of gravitation. And if we were just a bit heavier, quite a bit heavier, we would be rushing towards each other. You know, we don't want that, so we're quite happy with this. And the force falls off as the inverse square of the distance. This is something that you have heard, which means in simple languages that if this is the distance between the earth and the sun and the force is F, everybody is familiar with this kind of a language. Then if I increase the distance to 2F, what does the force become? 1/4 of it. It goes as the square of the distance, as in if the distance becomes twice, it goes as 2 to the power of 2. If the big distance becomes thrice, it goes to 3 to the power of 2. And we like to put all of this into a very nice mathematical form. We just write it like this. Force is inversely proportional to r square. Okay. We as theorists, we as physicists like expressions, mathematical expressions. They are beautiful. And this is the guy who wrote it down first. And he was very happy with it. But in spite of writing all of this down, you might ask, well, gravity is gravity and the law is law. Why do we want it? Why do we need it? Most of you might, you couldn't have asked your teachers because they'd scold you, but why do we need all this? Well, we need this because of a very serious reason. We need this because we like to calculate, and we can calculate. You can calculate what? You can calculate the velocity of an apple dropping and the velocity of a satellite going around the earth. The two of them are governed by the exact same laws, and if you apply the laws correctly, they'll give you correct answers in both cases. Think about it, it's just an apple on the earth. And then there is a big satellite going around the planet, and they're two completely disparate objects, and they're joined by this force of gravitation. Okay? And that allows you to calculate a wide variety of things, and that's why you have laws. It's basically simplifying nature. Okay? And so the answer to that question is because we can calculate. Okay? But fine, so you have theories, and you need theories. You need to make calculations, you need to make estimates. But how do you make them? Or in some time we'll see how do you break them? And in order to answer this question, I'm going to introduce to you a very favorite scientist of mine. You might have heard his name. How many of you have heard of Richard Feynman? Among the students, not the teachers. Students, okay, not many. So most of you go back, look him up. He's the coolest physicist who ever lived. He did physics, obviously, won the Nobel Prize and everything. He also played the bongos, and he was involved in the Manhattan Project, the atom bomb project. Do people know that? Okay. So he was also involved. He was one of the brainiest people ever. And he gave us a very nice algorithm to see what is what theory is what. So how do you come up with a theory? First, you start with a guess. Okay? First, you guess it. So that's your hypothesis. That's the underlying thing that you have to have in order to make any further progress. And then you compute the consequences of the guess. Okay. You take a guess, you see where it leads to, those are the consequences, those help you to make predictions. Okay. And after that, you compare those predictions with experiments. Fine. So say I have a theory, I'm a crackpot physicist, say I have a theory, we always have theories. And some theory, I don't know what it is, and say we calculate the consequences, and one of the predictions is that if I have a pen in my pocket, okay, I have a pen in my pocket, And if I just drop this, if I leave this, this will not fall down, this will go up. Okay? Say that is the prediction. What do? You compare with experiments. Does that really happen? Well, obviously it doesn't happen. So what do you do when it doesn't agree with experiments? If it doesn't agree with experiments, it's wrong. And according to Feynman, this is the key, one-line key to science. If it doesn't agree with experiments, it's wrong. You have any sort of theory you have, but you have to do experiments. If it doesn't agree, it's wrong. And he gave this in a talk. This is all from a talk he gave. It's called The Character of Physical Law. And he said, it doesn't matter how beautiful your theory is or how smart you are, what your name is, nothing counts. What counts is, does it agree with experiments? That's the only one question you need to ask. Okay? Now, we know this much. And armed with this knowledge, I'm going to go on to the second story. What do you think this story is going to be? A bit more difficult, but what do you think this is going to be? What is this? Tsunami, someone said waves. Okay, I'm going to go with waves. Okay, so these are water waves. What else do you know which have like some wave nature? What else are waves? Something else? Sound. Anything else? Light. Okay, many people said light actually. So in this section we're going to see how light builds itself and destroys it. It does all on its own. It builds itself, destroys itself, everything. Okay. Before that, I need to do a little bit of, well, to teach you a little bit. And don't be scared, it's very easy. So say you have two waves, okay. These are your two waves. Okay? And say the peak of this exactly coincides with the peak of this. And you add them up. If you do that, then say this is some 2, whatever units, 2 centimeters, 2 millimeters, whatever. Say 2 here and 2 here. This will become 4 here. Okay. So when the peaks match and when this, you call this a trough, the valleys basically, when the peaks match and the troughs match, the wave becomes a bigger wave. Two waves, peaks match, troughs match, they become a bigger wave. Okay. Two similar waves. What happens if they don't match? When the peaks coincide with the troughs, you're adding a 2 with a minus 2. What happens when you add a 2 with a minus 2? You get a 0. You get a flat wave. Nothing. So the waves can reinforce themselves and can also destroy each other. Okay? It depends on how you add them. It depends where the peaks are, where the troughs are and everything. Okay? And I found a very nice simulation. It's made by University of Colorado. This is the web address. I'm going to come back to this. This is, you can just search up wave interference, University of Colorado. You'll get it if you want. Okay, so let me see if I can get this running. Yes. So people have been to a pool, a pond. You've dropped water, dropped pebbles, and you've seen ripples. And these are how the ripples seem like, right? Everybody has seen this picture. This is pretty good. You have seen this. Let me put 2 taps. Now let's see what happens. Okay, can you see the patterns? These patterns are really beautiful. I want you to notice 2 things. One is there is a line here. This is V. Okay, there are no waves. Just the water there is absolutely still. There are no waves going up or going down. Absolutely still water. If you had stood there, you wouldn't have even known that there was a tap going if you couldn't see. Okay, and if you were standing somewhere here, like say you are on a boat and this is happening on a some ocean or something like that, you find a very calm ocean, but let's not get into complications. Your boat would once go up and then go down, go up and go down. Okay? Very nice. Okay? So just remember this pattern. I mean, you don't have to remember too much, just remember this pattern. And we're going to try this experiment with something else we know. We're going to try this experiment with light. Okay? So this is light. Okay, and you're looking at you're doing the experiment on the table and you're looking at it from the top. So this is the top view, and the light rays are coming from here and hitting the screen. So the screen is perpendicular. Okay, can everybody visualize this? The screen is perpendicular, the light rays are hitting like this. Fine. This is a 2D, so I can't show you anything more than this. And the screen has uniform illumination. Okay. Just in case you can't see because of the projector, I have a graph here, and if the line is flat, it's uniform illumination. Okay, this is basically the amount of light. This is the intensity. So if it's flat, the intensity is uniform throughout. Fine. Ignore the edges. It's fine. Now I'm going to make something. I'm going to introduce a barrier Barrier obviously stops light, but the barrier has a hole in it. Okay, we'll call that hole a slit, just like that. Now, if you can see, you'll see that this hole itself acts like a source of light. Can everybody see that? The hole itself acts like a source of light. So if you have a barrier, okay, and a hole in it, that slit itself is a source of light. Now begs the obvious question, what if I put two such holes to act as two sources of light? Correct? Let's do that. And now you have to look at the screen and look at the screen chart and let it form, and yes. So you have two sources of light and they behave exactly like water waves. Can you see that? Can you understand that it behaves exactly like water waves? Look at the pattern. There is this V which goes and hits here, and that's why these are black bands, and the central band is very bright. Remember this pattern. The pattern is characterized by this very bright central band. On the two sides of it, you have dark bands, and then there are again bright bands, but the secondary bright bands to the sides are not as bright as the central one. Yes? Everybody sees these features. Okay? Remember this because we're going to need it. Okay, so let's get back to what I was saying. Yes. And current slide. Okay, you can download this whole thing from that place. Okay, we know that. Let's keep it aside for the moment, and I'll come back to it in a bit. So about in the 1900s, we knew that light is a wave. By that time, we had figured out that light is a wave. Okay, and we knew that electrons, we are very familiar with electrons, we knew there were particles. Okay, you're going to take light and electrons. Light is a wave, electron is a particle. Nothing to be said about that. However, in 1905, someone had something to say about that. It was Albert Einstein, okay, the grand old man of physics. He said, wait a minute, I have this phenomena here. This has been verified by experiments. So you have a slab of metal, and light falls on it. Light of a certain frequency falls on it. And when that happens, you have electrons being emitted. Okay, this is called the photoelectric effect. Okay? You have a slab of metal, you have some light falling on it, electrons are being emitted. Now, people didn't know how to explain that. In 1905, people didn't know how to explain that. And then Einstein came up with a solution, which was a brilliant solution, which said, hang on, let's say that light is a particle. Let's say that it has at least a particle nature of it. It's a wave, I understand, but let's say sometimes it behaves like a particle. Can you explain that? And yes, Einstein could explain that. And well, in fact, I don't know how many of you know it, Einstein didn't get the Nobel Prize for relativity. He got it for explaining the photoelectric effect. 1921, photoelectric effect. Okay. But suppose we go one step further, and there's this Einstein-like guy who said, wait, I have an idea, another idea, and he says, okay, fine, light was a wave, it suddenly became a particle, or it has a particle nature. What about the things that we already know are particles, like electrons? Why can't they have a small wave nature to it? Light had wave nature, now it has particle nature, it is both. Why can't electrons, which were particles, have wave nature? That's our hypothesis. That's the guess we start off with. Okay? So, if you consider the Feynman scheme of things, the first line, guess that this is true. And by now you must be saying, let's see. So, once you start off with hypothesis, you have to calculate the consequences, and the consequences of this. Okay, before going to the consequences, I have to convince you that electron is a particle. The electron is a particle. I think everybody knows that electron is a particle. Not going to spend too much time on this. They flow through wires, they are charged, and so on and so forth. They also bend in a magnetic field. People know that electrons bend in a magnetic field, right? Right? So moving charged particles bend in a magnetic field. Electron bends in a magnetic field. Electron is a moving charged particle. Done. Fine. So electron is a particle. Okay. But if it's a wave, it should also show some interference effects. Right? We passed light through two slits, remember that? And we found these very nice patterns where you have the central band which was very bright, and then you have dark bands on two sides, and then you have other bright bands but not as bright as the central one. We know all this. If you did the same experiment with electrons, will you get that? We don't know. Let's see. So what are we supposed to expect? If it were a particle, it would be like shooting through two slits, and in this wall you would find two lines of electrons. Okay, two lines. Done. That's particle nature. It has no wave nature whatsoever. If it does have wave nature, it will show you interference patterns. Right? So let's do the experiment. So here you have the source of the electron, here you have two slits, forget about this, here you have two slits, here's the screen. Again, this is the top view, and the screen is going into the projector screen, and so you have particles going through, and they will, if these are just particles, they will simply form two heaps. Okay, and you will get something like this. People are okay with it? People understand this? Yes? What if it's a wave? If it's a wave, then it's a wave, it's like a light wave, and you will get this kind of a pattern. We saw this pattern, right? There's a central band which is very bright, and then there are these dark bands, and there are brighter bands which are not as bright as the central band. Everything very familiar, right? Done. Let's do the experiment. And this is a video. So each dot that you see on the screen is an electron. Okay, and so you are there's an electron being emitted from a source, and it is going through one of the slits and hitting that screen. So that's one dot, and then the next electron is being emitted, and then you do it for a long time. The first time this couple of people did it, I forget their names. A couple of people did it. They turned their apparatus on, went for a vacation, came back 7 days later. But so you have these electrons which are hitting the screen. Looks more or less random. Can anybody find a pattern here? More or less random? People agree it's random, or people are sleeping? Random. Okay. So more or less random. Okay, let's just wait for a little bit. So this is a 30-minute experiment this people did, and it's been compressed into a video of 1 minute. Can anybody see anything now? Yes? Little more? Little more time? Little more time. Can anybody see anything now? Yes. What can you see? Huh? Bright and dark bands. They are vertical bands which are bright and dark alternately, just like we saw. Just like we saw. So this reminds us of this. This is what you saw. This is what light does. But that's an electron. This is light. So you're forced to conclude that both have wave nature. So electrons do have wave nature. This is a fascinating thing. This is, by the way, this is one concept that is forced upon you by quantum mechanics. You might have heard of quantum mechanics. You cannot do without it. Now, some of you might say, "Theek hai, electron is a wave, it's fine, nice knowledge, nice trivia, nice question to ask in class, but what do we do with it? Why is that important?" People will ask this, why is it important? Why is something important? Well, if you have ever used a computer, or ever used a mobile phone, ever used anything which requires an IC, transistor, chip, anything, it depends very much on the fact that an electron is a wave. Okay? Some of you might be seeing some scanning, tunneling microscopes while you're in the labs later on. That will critically depend on electron having a wave nature. Okay? Anyway, let's move on. So let's just see what we have learned, and this is a loaded slide, so bear with me a bit, and you have to concentrate. So if you put forward a new hypothesis, why should you do that? Number one, the new hypothesis should explain stuff which is already known. It cannot do without it, right? It should also explain something new. That's why you put it up. Why else would you put it up? It should also predict something new. So all of these are reasons why you have a hypothesis. You have a hypothesis, it should agree with what you know, plus it should predict something new and explain something new. And in my opinion, the most important point is that there should be a scope to prove it wrong. Okay? As in, you make a hypothesis, and then people say, no, this is a hypothesis which is too vague to be proved wrong. That is a bad hypothesis. That's a bad theory. You don't even talk about those theories. The theory should be such that, when Einstein proposed the theory of gravity, he said, okay, fine, go do it, do these two experiments. I'm not going to go into the experiments. Do these two experiments. See if you get this outcome. Okay? If you don't get the outcome, my theory is wrong. But if you do get the outcome, then you can't say that it's wrong. Okay? But if you did not get that outcome, the theory would be wrong. Okay? So you have a theory, and there should be some scope for anybody to prove it wrong, and then that guy will try very hard to prove your theory wrong, but won't succeed. And that is a good theory. All the theories that have survived have this property, that they can be proved wrong very easily, but people have tried to prove it wrong and they have failed. Okay? You already know this, but what happens if it agrees with the experiment? I told you what happens if it disagrees with the experiment. If it agrees with the experiment, is it right? Yes? How many of you say yes? Loud. Yes? No. The theory is simply not wrong. Not wrong is not the same as right. Now, this is a subtle point to handle, but you should appreciate the fact that you can never say that a theory is right. Why? Because say 10 years down the line, somebody might do an experiment which might now contradict what your theory says. You might get better machines, you might get better accuracy, something like that, and then you will contradict what the theory says right now. Okay? So you can never prove a theory right, you can only prove it wrong. So our bottom line is, if it disagrees with the experiment, it's wrong. If it agrees with the experiment, it's just not wrong. Okay? It's the life of a theorist is pretty tough. Okay, next, third story, almost running out of time, third story, and this is a story which is very close to my heart, and I'm going to call it the King of Masses. And I'm not going to ask you to predict what it is, but I'm going to ask you if you have seen this picture. Has anybody seen this picture? Huh? The God particle. Let's call it the Higgs boson, can we? Yes, thank you. Let's call it the Higgs boson and not the God particle, because scientists like the word Higgs boson and not the God particle. So all of you are here with junior scientists, you guys are budding scientists, let's call it the Higgs boson. So this is the Higgs boson, a photo of the Higgs boson. And the Higgs boson is very heavy, so it breaks up very, Somebody said something? Okay. So the Higgs boson is very heavy and it breaks up very fast. So this is just a photo of it breaking up into two particles. Forget about that. And the person who discovered the Higgs boson, rather who predicted the Higgs boson right in the beginning, was this guy called Peter Higgs. That's why it got the name the Higgs boson. And the Higgs boson is supposed to give masses to all the elementary particles in the universe. So we can call him the king of the masses, right? And if you allow me one more pun, then I would say the story has a huge mass appeal. But let's get on to the story. The story starts in 1964. Okay? 1964, Peter Higgs, and there were a few others, who predicted that there should be a boson called the Higgs boson. There should be a particle called the Higgs boson. Okay? And you needed to give masses to various elementary particles. You have heard this. Now, how it gives masses is a technical issue. I'm not going to do it here. Okay? But you can ask me later in the Q&A session or outside. We're more than happy to tell you that. And people kept looking at it from different experiments. Now, we particle physicists do, high energy physicists do these experiments. We take two particles, okay, electrons or protons, and we collide them at very high energies. And that's all that we can do, nothing else. Okay, we are good for nothing except that we take two particles and collide them. Okay, we like to smash things together. And this is one of those machines. By the way, to do this, we have built huge machines. This is one of those machines. You know that the LHC is running, well, it's not running right now, but you know that the LHC exists. This was a precursor to the LHC. This was before the LHC came in. This was there in the same place. This is called the Large Electron-Positron Collider. Same place, CERN, Geneva. And what this did was it took an electron and it took another particle called the positron, which is just like an electron, except the charge is reversed. The charge is +1, except rather than -1. And they collided these two at very high energies together. Okay? Now, this kind of found the Higgs boson, did not find, no clear hints, just few faint hints. And then there was this other experiment called Tevatron. This was at Fermilab, USA. And this also helped in the search of the Higgs boson, but it's still not confirmed. Nobody was very happy with the results. And then came the LHC. And this was one of the detectors of the LHC. This is called the CMS detector. Okay? Now, many people in TIFR right now, many of the volunteers, actually work on this detector. Okay? They work with the data that is produced by this detector. TIFR has a huge role in the making of the detector and the working of it. And this is the CMS detector. Okay? This was one of the main detectors which helped in the discovery of the Higgs. There's another detector involved, which is called the ATLAS detector. By the way, this is one guy standing here, so you can understand the scale. Okay? Let me show you the ATLAS detector. And that one guy is here. So we've been crazy enough to build huge detectors, okay, huge detectors to know the very heart of matter, the very subatomic particles that we want to discover. And we have this, so the electron, the positron, the proton beam goes right through here, okay, right in the middle. The proton collides right in the middle, and there's debris which goes off everywhere, and one of the particles in that debris can be sometimes the Higgs boson, and we detect that, okay, and we detect that. And that's exactly why this has been built. Very high energy collisions of protons sometimes give you the Higgs, and then you detect the Higgs. And you need such huge machines in order to perform that efficiently, okay. And of course, the Higgs was discovered, and people were very happy, and you heard it in newspapers from scientists, might even have heard some talks. But the question is, were we supposed to be surprised the Higgs was discovered? What did scientists say? Were they surprised? Well, we have a very, very good theory for particle physics. And the theory for particle physics is known as the Standard Model. It's known as the Standard Model. It's just a theory of particle physics, okay, just a name. And it's a very, very beautiful theory being tested over and over again. People have tried to prove it wrong several times, but then it has never been proved wrong. I just told you a few slides back that you try to prove it wrong, but you just cannot prove it wrong. The Standard Model is one such theory. You try to prove it wrong, but it just doesn't go out of the picture. It's just correct. It's correct every single time. It agrees with the experiment every single time. Okay, that's a brilliant theory that we have, and one of the things that it predicts is that there should be a zoo of particles. There's like, you have the periodic table for elements, okay, here you have the periodic tables for particles. There should be like this particle, that particle, that particle, okay. Now you might have heard of, obviously you've heard of electrons, you have also heard of neutrons and protons, right? Okay, now neutrons and protons are peculiar particles in the sense that they have particles inside them. They are made up of smaller particles. The electron is not. The electron is just there. You can't divide an electron, but you can divide a neutron and a proton. Okay, and they're made up of particles called quarks, and these quarks are given funny names. They're called up quark and down quark and strange quark. Don't bother with the names. They're just names. Okay, but note something, that there was this prediction. How this prediction came about is too technical. There was this prediction in 1964, which got verified in 1969. So you made a prediction and was detected by experiments. Next, 1969, another prediction. 1974, you got detection. Next, 1967, one prediction. All of these from the Standard Model. And 1983, you discovered particles. And there have been many more such instances. Okay, so when someone predicted the Higgs in 1964, people were actively looking for it. People were expecting it. And when it was found in 2012, people weren't surprised. They were very happy that finally we have the final piece of the Standard Model, okay, final piece in this periodic table of particles, but they weren't really surprised. In fact, they were so happy they gave two gentlemen the Nobel Prize itself. So this year, the Nobel Prize for Physics went to Higgs and another guy called Francois-Englert. You might not have heard the second guy's name, but you've definitely heard of Higgs. It went for the discovery of the Higgs boson, okay, but the Nobel Committee tells you exactly why they give the Nobel Prize. Okay, they tell you exactly why they give the Nobel Prize, and the Nobel Prize was given for. You have to.
Just wait. The talk will get over in 5 minutes.
Yeah, exactly.
After the talk.
Yeah.
I gave you the biscuits, but just 5 more minutes. Let the talk get over, then we distribute. We take a 5-minute break. We've got stuff for you. Okay.
Okay.
Escort, just hang on. Just hang on 5 minutes. Escort, hang on. Hang on. Just 5 minutes, and then we'll get you. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. And if everybody is settled down. Okay, so they got the Nobel Prize. Okay, let me just restart because there was some commotion. So I was telling you, these two guys, Peter Higgs and Francois-Englert, got the Nobel Prize, and they got it for this huge thing. The citation is huge. There are lots of words here, but I wanted to concentrate on two things. One is that it was a theoretical discovery. In other words, it was a prediction. It was a prediction in 1964. That's why they got the Nobel Prize. But then you could have asked me, they predicted in 1964, you could have given it in 1964 or sometime just later than that. Why so late? Because till now, we did not have a confirmation by experiments. Okay? It is very, very, very important, no matter how much confidence you have in the Standard Model, no matter how much confidence you have in the theory, you have to confirm it with experiments. The ATLAS and CMS experiments have confirmed that the Higgs boson actually exists. It's not just a theorist's figment of imagination. So these two guys, this is Higgs, this is Englert, they're very happy, but remember the Nobel Prize, although it was given to them, it could have just been given to these three. I mean, Nobel Prize is not given to organizations, but if they could be, these organizations should also get Nobel Prize, the CMS and ATLAS, and of course the CERN, which is the umbrella organization for all of this. And somewhere back there, Feynman is saying, well, it doesn't matter how beautiful your theory is, you still have to confirm the experiments. Okay? And that's more or less all that I have to say. So when you walk out of this right at the end of the day, I want you to take home this message. One, that science really does explain a lot. When people tell you, does science know everything? Of course it doesn't know everything, otherwise we would be out of work. But science does explain a lot, okay? And Arnab already told you how to become a scientist. You should become a scientist, and then you have to know what the open questions are. When you become a scientist, you will find that there are lots of open questions. And these open questions should have answers. Right now we might not have answers, but if we are supposed to have answers, they will come from science itself, okay? And remember that you have a very crazy claim, an extraordinary claim, it will require extraordinary evidence. And for me, the most important key to science is ask questions. Ask questions, you know, during lunch, during the question answer session, after you go back, ask your teachers, ask people, look up books, whatever it is. That is really the key to science. Thanks for listening.